Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this next RSA conference session on how the identity portions of California's CCPA regulations put consumers and businesses at risk, also known as You Are Probably Not Rob Base, for reasons that shall become apparent in just a moment. My name is Jeremy Grant. I'm part of the cybersecurity and privacy practice at Venable. We're a law firm based out of Washington, D.C., though I'm not a lawyer. That's a story for another day. But I do want to talk about a new law, the California Consumer Privacy Act, and some of the impacts it's going to have on the security of consumers and businesses. For years, there's been a great cybersecurity meme that's been floating around the internet, basically mocking the way we do remote identity verification, focused on the first four lines of this song. Do you want to rock right now? Yes, I do. Did you come to get down? I always do. Are you internationally known? Trick question, no. Are you known to rock the microphone? Yes. If you answer all four of those questions, well, it proves you must be Rob Base. Now, is this a great way to do remote identity verification in 2021? It's a great meme to make fun of the way we have been doing it. Well, the state of California seems to think so. We'll be talking about how that is and why today. So let's start with the CCPA. It's the California Consumer Privacy Act. It was passed, basically written in a week or so back in 2018, more or less, to head off a ballot initiative that was heading for the ballot in November. And the California state legislature basically made a deal with the person driving the ballot initiative. If they could pass a law, then the ballot initiative would be pulled back. And what the law does is establishes a baseline of new privacy rights for California consumers. But the enacting regulations are left to the California Attorney General to craft. And you can see a link here to some of the provisions that I'm actually discussing today. Now, there is more. So there's CCPA, and now there's also the CPRA, the California Privacy Rights Act, or CAPRIA, passed by a ballot initiative last November, because it turned out the guy who put the ballot initiative on, and then they pulled it back when CCPA was passed and decided, no, we ought to have a ballot initiative after all. So that actually passed last November, and it substantially amends the CCPA, but it's not yet in effect, not until January 2023. So what we're going to be talking about today is how both of these laws essentially create a bunch of new rights for consumers, but also might create some problems in terms of the way the regulations are implemented. So some core new rights, let's talk about it. First, the CCPA says that you've got the right to access or know what personal information is collected or used or shared or sold by a company who might have come in contact with you or your data from some reason. Second, you have the right to ask that these businesses delete your personal information, as well as any of their service providers. So by and large, these are good things. I'll say as somebody who's been a privacy advocate for a long time, who worries about where my data is going and who can get access to it and the lack of control I have, this idea to give consumers, frankly, more control over their data and how they can actually decide who gets to do what with it is a really good thing. But to deliver it securely, you also need to know who's making the request. And that requires robust identity proofing capabilities as well as authentication. And the issue is, if you don't have good identity tools, well, you're opening up an attack vector for cyber criminals who might look to take advantage of these new provisions in order to steal your personal information. So we've already seen the impact of this thanks to a 2019 Black Hat paper that was published by two researchers, James Pavur and Casey Nair, called GDPR, which was basically looking at what happened in Europe, or what you could do in Europe, after Europe's privacy law, GDPR, was passed. So in this case, James, who at least at the time was dating Casey, I don't know if they're still together, though I hope they are and they're very happy. James posed as his girlfriend and submitted 150 different requests for her information to companies across Europe, basically saying, I'm Casey, but he wasn't. He was pretending to be her, with her consent, of course. Please give me my data as you're expected to do under GDPR. And the results were pretty amazing, which was that 40% of European companies either were happy to give her information to him without any identity verification whatsoever, or did such a weak form of identity verification as to basically be trivial. Anybody could have cut through it. This sort of exposed that in looking to do something to help consumers, give them the ability to request that their information be shared with them, even request to be deleted. If the companies that are implementing it aren't doing any meaningful identity verification, it's opening up a new attack vector, for attackers who might look to leverage this to steal this data. So armed with this study, because it came out as California's AG was actually working on crafting its regulations for the CCPA, what did California do? Well, they said for passwords, look, if you got a password in place, that's good. If a business maintains a password protected account with the consumer, the business may simply verify the consumer's identity through the existing authentication practices. If you got the password to prove you're you, does it or not, that's another question, but that's all you need to do. And if you don't have a password with somebody, well, then you got to do something else to try and figure out who they really are. And here is where the Are You Rob Base test really comes in. So as we'll talk about today, this test is actually more robust in strength than what California's put in place, in that this has 4 questions, whereas California only requires you to validate 3 pieces of data in order to figure out whether somebody is the Rob Base who they claim to be or not. So let's dive into this a little bit more. First, I want to dig into the password side of things. So section 999.324, for those of you who want to track sections and are following along with your copy of the CCPA regs at home. Verification for password protected accounts. Pretty straightforward. If a business maintains a password protected account with the consumer, the business may verify the consumer's identity through their existing authentication practices, provided the business follows the requirements in another section that isn't that important for this purpose. It also says that if you want to delete or disclose the data, they have to enter their password again. So passwords, right? This is the RSA conference. I think most people in this audience know a thing or two about how secure passwords are these days and can track the billions and billions of compromised passwords that have been documented by sites like Halab and Pwned. If we're using passwords here as the threshold, as the gate you have to clear in order to request your personal information, what could possibly go wrong? Well, the implications of this language are actually pretty interesting in that what it does is it says a compromised password is now more valuable. Because today, if I have got the password for one of your accounts, well, I can get access to the account itself, but I can't necessarily get access to all of the core data about you that's tied to the account. And that's a big difference in that the things that a consumer can do through account access versus the data that might sit behind it might be 2 different things. Well, thanks to the CCPA regs, a password now gets you not only account access, but also all of the underlying data underneath. Now, of course, a lot of this could be mitigated if there was some guidance in there to not just use passwords, but somehow use multi-factor authentication. But a reference to MFA in this is unfortunately nowhere to be found. Now, to California's credit, what they did do in the regulations is say, look, you're a business, you might think something's fishy. So if you're suspecting that there's fraudulent or malicious activity on or from the password protected account, well, the business shall not comply with the consumer's request. And I was excited to see this, in that one of the best tools we're seeing these days in the space to try and block attacks that are trying to leverage compromised passwords, be it credential stuffing, password spray attacks, phishing attacks, is if you spell something's wrong, if you're looking at a bunch of data that suggests maybe this person isn't what they claim to be, you can block it. And there's a whole bunch of different security and behavior analytics tools that are out there today that a lot of companies and others are using for this. But what do these security analytics tools require? Well, data. So this is where things get a little kooky. So CCPA lets you request that companies delete your data. They were modeling this after language that was in the European law, GDPR. But GDPR says you can't delete all data. It has a specific exception in recitals 47 and 49 for preventing fraud and ensuring networking and information security. Now, CCPA and CPRA tried to do something like this in section 198.105, but they left things a little open in another section, 17.98.120, which discusses a consumer's right to opt out of the sale or sharing of their personal information. But that opt-out doesn't create any exception for security and fraud prevention. Well, what's the practical impact of that? A lot of different behavior analytics tools and security analytics tools that are out there are going to look at not just how you're acting at a single site, but rather aggregating information about, say, how, let's say I'm logging in, with my smartphone, how is this device being used to conduct commerce at dozens of different sites? And if there's signals that show that suddenly it's fallen out of my hands, that it might be being used for fraud, you're able to essentially provide some data to anybody who's leveraging that service. Maybe that you want to apply some additional security controls if somebody's trying to log in from one of those devices. Microsoft has famously talked at other conferences about how they're blocking, I think, roughly 300 million attacks each day that are focused on compromising passwords by leveraging these security analytics tools. So because there's no provision that says that you can't essentially tell somebody no if they don't want their data to be shared, even if it's for security purposes, what we're now seeing is some companies and attorneys believe that consumers, or for that matter, a fraudster who might be posing as a consumer, could actually come to a company and say, I don't want my data to be used for security and fraud prevention, which creates a bit of a pickle for companies that are using these tools. What's the impact to your organization if 1 in every 50 California consumers comes to you with a request saying, I basically want you to stop using security analytics tools to protect logins and transactions? So looking at authentication in summary, anyone with a password alone can get access to your data. Compromised passwords are now more valuable because they give you access not just to the account, but to the data that's in the account. No requirement of or even mention of MFA. And they say you should use security analytics tools to sniff out fraudulent logins, but a consumer or a fraudster posing as them, say by stealing their password, might be able to demand you stop using them. So I'll say, well, the bear on the California flag looks very fierce, and I don't know if I want to mess with him. If I was a Californian, I might be feeling a little bit more like this bear instead, looking at this and wondering about the security of my data. And mind you, this is just about authentication. We haven't even gotten yet to the identity verification provisions. So let's dive into that a little bit next. So section 999.325, verification for non-account holders, basically says, look, if you don't have a password protected account with the business, well, the business still needs to figure out who you are because it's important that they give you your data. So they say, well, if you're just trying to get categories of personal information about you, we just want to validate who you are to a reasonable degree of certainty, which they say will include matching at least 2 data points provided by the consumer to match data provided by the business. But California then said, hey, we know some of these requests really might involve specific pieces of personal information, and there we're going to put a higher bar in place. We're going to say a reasonably high degree of certainty might include matching at least not 2, but 3 pieces of personal information with information that's on file with the business, which basically means that is still 1 factor less secure than the "Are you Rob Base" example, which has 4 questions and bluntly still doesn't offer much security based on what we're seeing with knowledge-based systems these days. So as you might imagine, hackers and cyber criminals are looking at all of this and thinking, this is pretty interesting. This might be worth dancing about. But wait, there's more, because they then go on to talk about illustrative examples in the regulations to try and give businesses a little bit more guidance in terms of how they might implement this. So they say, for example, if somebody doesn't have a password with you, but a business maintains personal information about your account, let's say a retailer has a record of purchases made by a consumer. If you can just ask the consumer, hey, what are 3 items you recently purchased from me? Well, then that will be considered identity verification, which, as some of you might have figured out, because this is the RSA conference after all, and some of you know a thing or two about security, this basically means if I hack your email, I can then go look at what you ordered online because the retailer sent me an email, and then I can go to the retailer and tell you what I bought and then get your data. Now, look, maybe this isn't going to be a total disaster. There might be ways this could be implemented by some companies that might not lead to every Californian having their data just pillaged. But it does beg the question, which is why is the California Attorney General getting into the business of setting standards for authentication and identity verification? Is this an area where the AG has some special expertise? Is identity like auto emissions, where California wanted to set a high bar compared to the rest of the country years ago for authentication and ID verification that everybody else would follow? And one of the challenges is that all of these regulations will basically be codified into law, and they're not really easily updated, even as attack vectors continue to change and the technology we use to protect accounts changes. Now, if only the government somehow had a resource, perhaps at the federal level, that was tasked with creating and regularly updating standards for digital identity and authentication, that the states could just reference these experts instead of creating their own standards. Oh, wait, NIST does that. But this is not what's been done here. So I want to just give a couple more points on, I talked before, told you once about CCPA and then how it was amended by the California Privacy Rights Act, and it'll be in effect in 2023. There's a couple items of note in terms of how it changes the CCPA. So first, they're trying. They basically redid section 1798.105, coming up with a security exception of consumers' right to delete personal information that said, any data you've got to help ensure security and integrity to the extent the use of the consumer's personal information is reasonably necessary and proportionate for those purposes, well, you don't have to delete it. Now, setting aside, I mentioned I'm not a lawyer, but I work in a law firm, getting an attorney to agree on what's necessary and proportionate and the ambiguity that puts in place. Setting that aside, even with this modified language, it doesn't address the issues I talked about a few slides back in section 1798.120 that would allow a consumer to ask that their data not be shared, even if it's only being used for ensuring security and integrity. So this is the whole opt-out issue before with regards to the use of security analytics tools. This is an issue that isn't fixed. Now, the new law also comes up with the concept of what they call verifiable consumer requests. Essentially, these requests are coming in to see your data, to delete it. How do you determine that it, triggers what's considered a verifiable consumer request? And they say, well, that'll be pursuant to regulations adopted by the Attorney General pursuant to paragraph 7 of subdivision A of section 1798.185. So what does that actually say? Well, if you go to it, it basically is new direction to the Attorney General to do what the Attorney General just finished, which is to come up with regulations to try and figure out how a business could determine for requests for information from somebody is a verifiable consumer request, including password protected accounts, as well as what to do if you don't have a password. So basically what the AG just finalized. Now, in theory, is this a chance for a do-over? My read of it is, given that it basically points to what's been done already, I don't know that that's going to happen. But I think if there's one takeaway that I'd like everybody to come away with today, in addition to understanding some of the risks that CCPA, while well-meaning, is now introducing into the way companies are going to have to handle information, is that there might be a chance for a do-over between now and 2023. And it'd be good to let core stakeholders in California understand the need to tighten some of these things up a little bit to better protect information. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.